The fundamental purpose of learning is knowledge, but the expected goal is understanding. We can learn a process, and at the lowest level, that leads to a useful conclusion. For many immediately practical purposes, that's sufficient. Oftentimes, society rests on the expectation that what's learned is only learned atomically as an individual item of process, isolated. This is in effect what drives bureaucracy, and it also, though, is what drives stability. Nobody can know everything, and by learning a process that has been reiterated and refined over many generations of adaptation and adjustment, we end up with something that is largely successful in the face of great obstacles. We need to be able to take someone, assume that they're going to make mistakes, assume that they're going to miss things, and still have the process so redundant and so thorough that across hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of instances, it remains successful the majority of times. And we see when this process breaks down, when municipal works fail, when something comes off the assembly line broken. But the marvel is that it all works. And often it works, at least at the lowest level, because of this reiterative approach that's based on rules, that's based on repeated patterns, not understood, because understood patterns have to be interpreted, and interpretation fail when it's en masse, with every one of 10,000 different people interpreting it slightly differently, but rather through a repeated process, baked into that repeated process in a way that is repeatable and sustainable across large numbers. In this lies sustainability, but not necessarily growth. Growth requires breaking the rules. Breaking the rules without disaster requires interpretation, which requires knowledge and understanding. When we learn a skill, or when we learn how something works, we can learn it in isolation, or we can learn it as part of the bigger scheme of things. The bigger the scheme, the harder it is to understand, and the harder it is to apply immediately. But the further we're likely to get in adapting and growing, those processes, after all, need to change somehow. Life changes, technology changes, even in the slowest of times. Still adaptations were made, still circumstances changed, even if individuals and cultures wanted to be immutable, still those changes occurred. And so processes needed to change as well. And if all you understand is the process, it becomes extremely difficult to react. But if you understand the causes behind the process, if you understand the inner workings of the task, you can adapt it. There's danger in that as well. You need to know the rules well enough and know why the rules are there well enough that you apply the rules maybe 99% of the time or more, because they're there for a reason. But with sufficient understanding of the causes and context, you can also adapt. This is the crux of modern education. We have highly complex processes, systems, tasks. Our technology is embedded with them, and we have to follow them precisely and have our technology follow them precisely in the extraordinarily overwhelming majority of cases. If your technology winged it, our society would fall apart. We're built on a highly robust and yet highly fragile system because through all the redundancies, through all the safeguards, they're all dependent on everyone following those systems and understanding that those systems are there to be followed. All it takes is for us to decide we know better for things to fall apart. And so we need to learn how to follow those systems, and a large part of education is learning to get along in a world that's baked into our education. We have lessons in critical thinking, but we have more lessons in how to do a certain thing, how to understand a very specific mathematical system, how to write language to such and such a purpose. We learn how to compare and contrast, write a persuasive essay, report on something that happened historically. In shop class, we learn how to take things together and pull things apart and do it in very specific ways, use tools as they're meant to be used. You can get kicked out of shop if you're not using it that way, and for damn good reason. The algorithms through which we live our lives, which guide our use of technology, which cause us to log into one system using a third-party provider so that we can then follow the expected tasks, whether it's putting in a purchase order or accounting your expenditures or any of a million other things. We need to know how to do them. If we're not technically literate, technically in the broad sense, these technical patterns, these algorithms of life, then we won't be able to get through life. The phraseology of the O's and into the teens of the digital divide represents a real problem, in that if you don't know how to manage the technology, if you don't understand what you're looking at and how to use it, you will increasingly be left behind, increasingly be unable to manage your own existence. But to get a little bit further, individually and societally, we need to be able to do more. We've attempted to give these broader lessons to our students through the use of teaching critical thinking. We learn in STEM education how to think logically. In science, we learn how to break down causes, how to apply the experimental methods, how to come to verifiable conclusions, supportable ones. And yet we learn them in a very formalized fashion, of necessity. You need to be able to recreate the same learning experience for 100 different kinds of students every year. Standardized teaching exists for a reason. It ensures, for the most part, a base level of comprehension success. At least that's the idea. But that's not enough. Certainly not anymore. Certainly not if you want rising adults to be not only successful in their own right, but manage successfully a growing and changing society. It requires the ability not only to manage the processes that are at the root of our society, but also to understand them sufficiently in context that they can then adapt those rules and do so with cognizance of how that will impact everything that those processes touch. And that requires a very flexible kind of understanding. That can be inculcated, but it's not as simple. What's the answer? Well, there's no easy answer. A lot of it falls onto the learner. We can teach our students to adapt to change. We can add a little bit of variety and flexibility into the curriculum. We can introduce new concepts and new topics. And to some extent, the newer generations understand change as a constant. It's there implicitly. And yet, we can see that what you grow up with is what you know. We can adapt how we teach, and that's good. We should. We continue to iterate while respecting the foundations of education. We have to note what's new in society and what will be new and how to change. But as adults, it's also a responsibility for each of us not only to continue to learn, but to consider how we're learning. And when we digest material, whether that's something as simple as a new application we pick up, or if it's a book we read at home about the state of things, or if it's an article that we scroll through on our phones, or any of 1,000 different kinds of information that crosses our path and is sufficiently factual to influence the way we might live, the way we might act. It's important to take a step back and understand it in its context and be able, therefore, to see the patterns behind it, see what makes it operate. A book on managing teams in 2026 is not the same thing as a book on managing teams from 1986. That's obvious. But why? Humans fundamentally haven't changed that much from 1986 to 2026. Certainly not evolutionarily, psychologically, only in a very limited way. And in fact, there will probably be some lessons you can take from the book from 1986, but most of them won't apply. But if you read the book from 1986 and you read the book from 2026, what you're seeing is not so much a change in leadership, you're seeing and sensing a change in society. Again, that's also obvious. But if you can look at this 40-year gap and see those changes and recognize that we're changing even faster now, then the lessons learned from the 2026 book will apply probably for even shorter of a time, which means that the difference between the two books, the distance, conceptual, is really what's more important. Pick out tools, techniques, tips, ideas, thoughts. But you can also take a step back and think, why? Why are these specific lessons applicable? What do they mean? Why are they being said here and now? Why is this lesson applicable to 2026? And why is that other lesson from the 1986 book applicable to that? Not just because we're using some different kind of computer or some different kind of system, but because how we're expected to approach those systems. Gleaning that information, sitting down and taking the time to wrestle with that just a little bit, produces the kind of metatextual information that allows us to stay on top of evolving patterns. Even while we are, as they say, learning the rules like a pro, we can also learn how to break them like an artist. But you can only do that if you understand both parts. Having the rules without the pattern is limiting. Having the pattern without the rules is destructive. With both, you can be successful day to day in the current situation and yet be preparing yourself and your segment of society for the next step.